Johanna Pan and Shayna O'Neill have recently started a podcast called Dirty Laundry, and I'm so excited to share the conversation that I had with them on this week's episode of the Backstage Creative. Welcome to another episode. I am Krista Copper. This conversation, I am so thrilled to share this conversation with you. I learned a lot from it. Johanna and Shayna started Dirty Laundry, Unpacking the Costume Closet podcast a few months ago, and are delving into some really important issues in the theater world, issues that not only affect costume land, but also the industry as a whole. I admire their courage. Some of these issues are difficult and they're kind of taboo. And I admire people who are willing to dive in feet first and to maybe get a little uncomfortable and talk about things that are important and overlooked. This was the first time I interviewed two people at once. And so I was very nervous going into this conversation because it can be hard to kind of be the moderator, of a conversation and who's going to answer the question first, and to kind of feel that and to help them feel comfortable with answering. But they were both fantastic and made it so easy. And yeah, this conversation was a delight. It was also a delight to edit because they're both very articulate, and so that made the editing process go a lot better. I never look forward to editing. I think that's fairly common among podcasters to not look forward to the editing part because it's kind of tedious and it's really just taking out a lot of ums and and likes. But I think it's necessary. There is a podcast I listen to. It's bass related, and he doesn't edit his interviews, and so I don't listen to every episode because it kind of sometimes it gets a little much with the ums, and I think you just notice kind of all of those filler words more when you're just listening to audio. In everyday life, you're just getting more input, right? Like visual and background noise that I think we don't quite notice all the filler words that we use. But I think in a podcast setting, you notice it a lot more. So anyway, check out their podcast, Dirty Laundry, Unpacking the Costume Closet. Even if you're not in the costume world, you'll learn and you'll be able to apply what they talk about to whatever corner of the theater world you inhabit. So here we go. Here's my interview with the creators of the Dirty Laundry podcast. You guys are on because you have a podcast of your own. It's such a great idea, and I'm so excited to talk about it because it's such a great concept, and I think it covers a lot of really important issues in our industry. So how do we want to do this? Who would like to kind of would one of you like to give the overview of what is Dirty Laundry and why it was started?
I'll let Shayna give the overview and then I'll say why it started.
Okay,
How about
great.
that?
Yes, that's a good split, I think. So the overview of Dirty Laundry is that it's a podcast about the intersection of social issues and costume design, and more broadly, theater and the performing arts in general. And our idea is to do one episode a month for our first quote unquote season, focusing on different topics. And so far, our first episode was on feminized labor and pay equity and labor equity. And our upcoming episode, which is coming out 2 days from when we're recording this, is going to be on black hair. And we have a lot of exciting topics in store. We're looking at pregnancy and postpartum bodies. We want to look at fat phobia, trans and gender issues, decolonization, so many other things that we're hoping. So we're hoping to kind of give a sort of a primer on each one of these subjects, and then use our show notes and our website to provide even further research and details and resources for people who want to dig in further. And then hopefully get feedback for, if we keep going after that, if there are more subjects that we can tackle. And the other big thing for us is that we are very, very committed to making sure that everyone who comes on to talk to us about their personal experiences receives some sort of an honorarium for their work and emotional labor. And also that we're drawing from the broader theater community. So not just white theater practitioners in New York. In fact, like very much not that. We want theater practitioners from all around the country, and we want people from all different sorts of backgrounds. This is Johanna's brainchild, so she can talk more about how it came about.
Yeah, so the podcast kind of came about. So I was working in the United States on this visa called Artist of Extraordinary Ability, and I've been working in the States for the last, well, before COVID, the last 10 to 11 years. And I think like what drove me a little crazy, especially in the last 4 years in the previous administration, was this inability to vote and inability to enact change. And this was a place that I basically was calling was my chosen home, right? I had chosen to move halfway across the world, live apart from my family, to pursue this career and this industry that was so important to me, but in this place that meant something to me. And I was absolutely helpless. And I wanted to be able to affect change in a way that felt positive. I needed something to do with my election anxiety. I needed something to kind of channel all of that into a way that was productively doing something instead of me just spinning in a circle. And it felt like all some of these things were issues that either like we were often talking about in a costume circle, but wasn't actually being shared with in broader circles. And it felt like a podcast, particularly in the pandemic, was a great way to start tackling that. Because I think what is most important about this podcast is that while we're talking about costumes, actually the goal of our audience isn't really just more costume folks, but actually everybody who does theater, because these are issues that actually like stage managers, we need stage managers to help us with, and we need production managers to help us with, and we need directors to understand some of these things, that it just wasn't like these issues just were kind of like stuck in costume land, and we've been talking about them in most places, but not everyone was talking about them. And then the it's like they're always like, as with any collaborative art, right? Like it's not just us in a room doing our own thing. Like I think that there's also this perception that like costume folks go off and they do something magical and it comes back, and like we don't really understand the magic, but it's here and it's great. And it's also so separate from scenic lighting and sound, because like scenic lighting and scenic, especially because like people can see kind of like the tangible stuff that really happens. Costumes often, because they're clothes, they seem like something that is so easy and accessible to do oftentimes as well. And so we don't really get actually like the magic that happens in a costume shop, kind of the problems that we face in a costume shop that go beyond, oh, we're just making clothes. I felt that that was something that was really important to address, and something that I really wanted to share with people outside of the costume world, what was happening and how they could support us, not just instead of just saying that like our theater supports EDI, like how can you do things that actually practically enable costume designers to do their job better, to help actors do their job better, to make everyone's job easier in a way that actually helps them and impacts them on a daily basis.
I love that. I love that. And yeah, I think there's so many issues that as a theater industry we're talking more about during the pandemic, because we have a lot of time to do that. And I'm excited for this podcast and the topics that you guys are talking about. Like I applaud your courage to tackle some of these topics, because I'm sure that they might be uncomfortable, or just like you've mentioned, like take a lot of emotional labor to dig into these. So I love that you guys are stepping out and doing this. I was just clicking around on your website, and like, man, you guys are so like further along than me, because I don't have a website. I just post on Facebook, and I love that you're providing resources too. I think that's important. Sometimes with these conversations, it can feel a little like, okay, but what do we do? Like this is an issue, but how do we, like as myself as a musician, what do I do about this information? So I love that you provide resources around the topics that you talk about.
A lot of people we bring on the show, or are going to be bringing on the show, they teach workshops on their area of expertise,
Mm.
or they have written like very important, very informative articles on the issue that we're talking about. So we try to connect to those things specifically, link to them so that people can get more actionable items to follow up on, that sort of directly relate to not only what we were talking about, but who we were talking to.
Mm-hmm. So how are you finding these resources? How are you finding these people? Are they mostly friends of yours that you're having these conversations with? Are there certain like groups on Facebook or websites that you're finding information about topics that you're going to talk about?
Yeah, so there's a combination of that. So on one hand, a lot of these people are folks that we've worked with, and also very often have been very active doing in these scenes. And if we don't know them, then we get someone else to introduce us to them. So someone who's coming on to talk it on our environmental sustainability episode is actually someone I've never personally worked with, but is a friend of a friend. And then after that, we got introduced to each other, and now we talk all the time because we're all like both really involved in the same circles, and now we're so glad we finally made this connection. So it's very exciting.
I think it's very much like how a lot of us end up navigating our jobs in theater is, you tap into your network and find out who knows the person you're trying to get in touch with and see if they will introduce you. And so far, we've gotten a very enthusiastic response, not to like toot our own horn too much, but from other people in the profession. So, which I've been very grateful for. People so far have been really wanting to come talk to us, which is exciting.
Mm-hmm. What I love about podcasts is you can do so many different things with them. There's not one way to do a podcast, and I like just like the deepness of this idea. But yeah, so I appreciate that you're willing to like get dirty, and I love the cleverness of your title. It's great.
The other part of it is that we also look for people who not just people who are in costumes, but we also look for stage managers, and we look for we're like, the goal for some of these things is to find a casting director, right? To have a conversation about casting, and to have a conversation about like, what does it mean when a production manager doesn't budget for hair and makeup? Like, how do we actually have those conversations beyond just costume folks? So that's the other, to me, really fun part about what we've been doing in curating our guest list, is that it's about costumes, but we're also trying to point out that all of these issues go beyond costume land, and all of these other people are involved in it. And how do we continue to involve them in this conversation that we continue to have?
Right, right. Because none of this is separate. Like none of our pieces exist in a vacuum. And I think, to go back to something that Johanna was saying earlier, for whatever reason, I can think of a lot of reasons actually, there is this sort of more of a separation that like costumes is happening somewhere over here. But it's not. I mean, it's all linked,
In a
and for,
basement somewhere.
yeah, and for most of us who do, like, I primarily work as a stage manager, and Johanna obviously primarily works as a costume designer. For all of us who do show specific work, by the time we get to the project, so much groundwork has been laid that it is too late to change, that ends up affecting all of us. The budget in general, the schedule, the show has been cast, et cetera, et cetera. So these issues that we're finding that we're dealing with in rehearsal, in shows, all stem back from decisions that were made before we even got there. So it can't just be us who are trying to address them. We have to get the theater community as a whole, the people who are at the theaters full time, the production managers, the producers, et cetera, on board to really, I think, affect change. And also, the name of the podcast was Johanna's idea.
As
I
actually, I
love
think it was my sister's idea.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
We bounced around several names, and yeah, she was the one who helped me with it. She also, I think, like, drew the font for Dirty Laundry itself. She's was graphic design trained and does a lot of advertising. So yeah.
Yeah, I definitely like was like when I started my podcast was like messaging my like graphic designer friends and people who know about audio, like, hey, can you help me with this project, because I have no idea what I'm doing. Johanna, I would love to talk to you about I was looking, and you, correct me if I'm wrong, you do like a talk or teach a class about decolonizing costumes. Is that, am I getting?
Yes. So
Yes.
actually, that's going to be episode 3.
Okay.
It's coming up because Clint Ramos, who I co-teach the class with, is going to come on as a guest, and we're going to talk more about that for sure. But so we've been teaching this class of costume history at University of California, Santa Cruz. Actually, we just finished our last class yesterday here in Singapore, but it's basically we had 10 classes, and how the class normally runs in most institutions is that they go through from the beginning of time, or Egypt really, and they work through Egypt, Greece, Rome, ancient Greece and Rome, and then they go through most of like Western history, and they work their way steadily all the way through time until contemporary today. So when I was an undergrad, we did that class in 2 semesters, 3 times a week, 3 hours a week, basically. And in graduate school, we did a slightly different version of that class where we tried to do that for 1 semester, and then the other semester we spent just going into one decade, so kind of researching like the full depth of a decade and understanding all the different things that you could find out if you were really going like super in depth into research. I think what I found problematic in both of those classes is that it was a very Eurocentric point of view. And even in graduate school, I think we really tried for it to not be Eurocentric, but it still ended up being Eurocentric. So fundamentally, when Clint asked me to teach this class with him and he asked me to start lesson planning it, I immediately knew, like, I was like, the very first thing we have to do is to make sure this class is not Eurocentric, because that's how all of these classes are taught. And that's not how I view the world. And that's not how I want students to view the world. And I want to offer them a different perspective of it that isn't just Eurocentric, because it really, it shouldn't have to be. So what we did was that we actually broke up our class into each week into different places in the world that we wanted to visit and different points in time. So we did do like a little bit of like, we did do ancient Greece and Rome, and then we did do like Victorian and Elizabethan, because we felt that those were fairly important, particularly with the plays that were written in that time period and how often we come back to those time periods, right? But with Shakespeare and with naturalism, like that, like those time periods come back over and over again. But then basically for the other 7 classes, we picked different places in the world. We also did one that was American frontier, which was cowboys and saloon girls and miners. But then we also made sure to counterpoint that with like an entire week on like just Native Americans, right? And that they weren't actually sharing a week, because they often are talked about in tandem, but we wanted to make sure that Native Americans got their own week in all of this. And we went to India and we talked about caste systems, and we went to Latin America and we talked about the colonization of the Spanish, and how all of that destroyed so much of that landscape. And we went to China and Japan, and even talking about things like how that history is also complicated, right? Because China colonized Japan and Japan colonized Southeast Asia, and how all of those things actually do link up to each other in the broader picture of the world. And I think that tracing costume history and fashion history through this idea of like trade and actual history to me was really important, because my mother's a tour guide. She's basically a local historian, and my aunt's an anthropologist. And that's actually kind of one of the reasons why I think I got into costumes, is that I was always hearing stories about people, and the stories about other people and other cultures was something that really fascinated me. And so teaching this class, it's actually like what we ended up doing is that we in class, we just have a picture. Like I would give Clint a picture and he would give me a picture, and then we would both research that picture from that place or time, and come back and explain that picture to each other in class, right? So it was, the class was also more about like understanding how to research something, understanding that the whole internet is now available to us, and we like, it doesn't make any sense anymore to teach a class that's super specific about this is a bustle and this is an X and this is Y and this is a spoke heel on a shoe, right? These are all things that we can look up with the internet now. It's whether or not you're looking in the right places and the right sources and learning how to research all of that information. So we would basically research each other's image and came back and then accompanied with like a little bit of a history lecture about that time period. And every week our students were doing the same thing. So we would assign them a random picture, and then they would go off and research that picture. And what happened was that in a lot of other classes, other versions of this class that I've heard of from friends, was that they would get to pick their own picture. And the problem with that is that your own internal bias would then kick in, right? If I ask you to go look for a picture from the Victorian time period, chances are you're going to find me a picture of a woman in a Victorian dress, a picture of a white woman in a Victorian dress, and she's going to be upper class. She's going to be wearing something nice, and it's the go-to, right? Because that's what people have in their brain as what Victorian clothing looks like. But in our version of the class, because we were assigning these pictures, we covered the full range and gamut of like class and race within those time periods, right? So I would like half the pictures of like Victorian times were actually people of color,
Mm.
right? And more than half of those pictures were also people not of an upper class. Right. And so the goal is that these students would have to figure out who are these people, where do they live, where do they come from, what class are they, what's their occupation, like what, and then like how does that affect what they're wearing. It's the first time we've ever run this class, so I really really hope that like in some way like this really works, and that they start to think about and start to realize that, you know, this, like these landscapes are full of so much more different people and things that than you realize is in a time period. They're also encouraged to look at everyone else's work, so all they submit all of their homework on a Google Drive, and they can go and look at their classmates' assignments because everyone's researching a different image. So essentially, like if you go through and read everyone else's work, you'll have researched like over 30 to 40 images, and you can see like what everyone else is writing, what everyone else is finding. And they're also really encouraged to share their resources. So we have a research methodology resource, a Google sheet basically, with like I put down like a lot of the books that I use for research and like online resources that I use. But there's a sheet of it that's like just resources that my students have found that they wanted to share with their classmates, right? So then it doesn't just become I'm researching in isolation. I'm researching with a team and a group of people who are sharing things that I can also use in the future, which I thought was really helpful. It's the same thing with American Frontier. It's so much more colorful than people recognize or like realize. Like Black cowboys are huge, and there's such a lovely culture of it, and people don't know that.
I want to take your class. That sounds so interesting.
Yeah.
I feel the exact same way. I'm like dying to audit this class somehow.
Yeah.
It's over. We just finished it.
Well, if they are know what's good for them, you'll be teaching more, I think. So
Yeah. It's the same issue with music. Like, you know, you
Hmm.
take a music history class, then there's like a world music class, and it's like, well, wait a minute. It's not I don't
Yeah,
yeah.
there's like one class for the rest of the world. You're like,
Yeah.
that's not real.
Yeah. Isn't it the Western world part of the world too? Why is it a separate? But yeah, yeah, music has a very similar, very, very similar issue. Yeah. So then you put out an episode. What was for feminized labor, right? That's your
Yes.
first episode.
Yeah.
So give us an overview, a little taste of feminized labor and that issue.
Oh, feminized labor is this idea that women get paid, or actually not even women, people get paid less for their labor because the perception is that what they do is a job for women or is a
Mm.
feminine job. So, this idea of making clothes is something that is very domestic. Working on costumes is something that is a domestic issue because, you know, my mother can sew and my aunt can sew, and you know, my mother was a volunteer at school and made me costumes, right? So it has to be really really simple, and it has to be really easy to do. You know, shopping isn't work, shopping is fun, you shop all the time, right? So it's this idea that that like it's so simple, like, you know, I don't have to pay you the same amount of money as I pay the men who are in carpentry, or like the folks who are in carpentry, because that's hard labor and you're not doing hard labor. So that's basically what feminized labor is. And it perpetuates like the whole industry really, and it even goes back to things as simple as like even on Broadway, local one, which is carpentry, sound, and lights and projections, I believe, gets paid more than local 764, which is a wardrobe union. So they're a separate union because of how they were formed and because of who they are, right? And also like they get paid less, like the rates are less, and they've tried to equalize that, but they've run into some other issues within the union that have stopped that from happening. But I would also argue that in the pandemic, union 764 is the one that has taken care of their members the most,
Hmm.
because I had conversations with some of my friends who are all in 764 and about how the union was taking care of their insurance and like really taking care of them during all of this, and they were like, your local isn't doing this for you? And I was like, no, that's not happening. Like,
And to be
Yeah.
clear, that these two locals that Johanna is talking about are under the same umbrella union. So they're both under
Hmm.
IATSE. They're not like two completely separate unions, which I think makes it starker and a little more galling that the pay rates are different, as opposed to comparing like what Actors Equity is doing versus what
Right.
IATSE is doing.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's frustrating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Pay parity between set and costume designers only was achieved like in the last few years.
What?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Specifically, pay parity between set and costume designers on Broadway.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Just within the past few years, took over a job production managing an opera in Connecticut that I had previously stage managed for, and so I was suddenly privy to a lot more information about the budgeting than I had previously had, and for reasons that I could see no explanation for. The lighting designer and the set designer got paid more than the costume designer. That was how the standard budget was built. Even though actually in this particular situation, the costume designer had more seniority with the company. She had been there longer than the returning lighting designer and the brand new, we hadn't used before set designer, but it was just allocated that way. There was also budget for carpenters, a technical director, a master electrician, assistant designers for both the set designer and the lighting designer. And there was budget for one combo assistant slash wardrobe crew person for the costume designer.
Yeah, that's the other actually really frustrating thing. We didn't talk about this as much in the podcast because it's a little harder to define, but the fact that like it's not just money, it's also support and labor. That costume designers often don't get the same kind of support for their work as like the set and lighting and sound designer do, right? So
Mm-hmm.
we don't get as much trained personnel, which means that when you also have less demand for costume folks, the costume folks that exist are getting paid less. So it goes both ways, and it's really frustrating because like my assistant will be expected to exactly as Shayna said, do wardrobe as well, right? And then
Mm-hmm.
they're doing double duty, and it's not fair to them. um
Right. Yeah, and I
yeah.
remember I asked the other people in the organization, "What is there a reason for this?" Because it was my first time practically, executing a budget, and nobody had any answers for why it was like that. It was whoever had made it before had based it on their experience at a different theater company, and who knows where that theater company had gotten their numbers. But when I actually, said, why is this? Is there a reason? Should we be hiring these designers earlier and they're with us longer and that's why we're giving them more money? Or do we not do as elaborate costumes as we do sets? And that's why we don't need as many people to create the costumes as we need to create the sets. But it was always just, oh no, that's just how it is, you know? And rebalancing it only made things better.
There's another conversation that's happening with costume professionals for wage equity, which is Jessa Ray, who was one of our guests on the podcast. But the organization itself, Costume Professionals for Wage Equity, was actually born out of this frustration at feminized labor. Um, and they've been talking about trying to renegotiate contracts for designers so that they get paid extra for fitting days, because a lot of theaters will like have a costume designer fly in and then drag out fittings over like 5 or 6 days out of town. And what actually happens is that it's because directors don't want to give up actors during rehearsal time. But then it prolongs our labor because then we're out of town working on a show for like maybe even a week, right? When we could have actually gotten all of it done in 2 or 3 days. And because, we're often stacking all of these jobs on top of each other, like we have, like every day we spend out of town is another day we can't work on something else, or it makes it really difficult for us to work on something else. And so we've been trying to think about ways of like renegotiating like contract language to actually say like, hey, like what if we started requiring that we get paid for each fitting day, or like that we have a limit on the number of out of town days based on our first negotiation. And if it goes over that, then we have to get paid extra for each day we're out of town, because oftentimes costume designers will spend so much more time out of town than all the other designers do, right? A lighting and sound designer don't come into town until tech or the like 3 days before tech for the design run. And a set designer might come down once to visit and check on the set and like how it's being built, but oftentimes like now with technology, like a camera suffices, right? And they don't actually have to be there. But costume designers are always the ones that have to spend so much physical in-person time doing fittings, especially when like directors won't release actors from rehearsal. Like it can become very hard for us to work our schedules around that. And I think that honestly, I understand like their need and desire to like have people in rehearsal and like actually blocking the show. That's really important, obviously, but also like that directors need to understand that like our jobs are important too, right? That like if you don't give me an actor for fittings, like that actor's going to be naked on stage in 2 weeks. So how do we really have this conversation in a productive manner? Because I've worked with so many directors that have just refused to release actors from rehearsal. I'm at a loss because then no one knows how to help me or support me, and it's just one more thing on my plate where like I can't do this. I can't do my job.
Yeah, and I have to say, this is where, I mean, obviously we need directors to understand this more. But also, this is where people like stage managers, depending on how the organization is structured, production managers and or producers slash artistic directors can come in to set up a tone from the beginning that this collaboration is going to be required, this give and take is going to be required, that the costume designer's time is valuable, that everyone needs to approach it from the beginning, like just like blocking, just like every other thing, fittings are a part of the time that we need to block out. And if we can't make it work, then we need to reevaluate the overall picture, as opposed to just saying, well, sorry, but the costume people are just going to get the short end of the stick. But we can't do that if sort of like everyone isn't aware that these things are happening.
Mm-hmm. So in costume world, are these issues pretty noticeable? Like, do you feel like everyone kind of in the costume world sees them and everyone just kind of accepts them? Or is it more of just, I mean, Johanna, what do you think of, of the people that you come across who work in costumes? Are these all kind of issues that are noticed and talked about?
So specifically, I think with feminized labor, I think it's something that people have felt but not been able to articulate. It was something I
Mm.
actually was like very unable to articulate for a very long time. And then I read this book called Women's Work, and it was the first time I'd seen the phrase and like this idea of describing domestic activities as being the domain of women, and how actually like because of that, like in the field, and this book was about specifically about archaeology and anthropology, but how that had affected the study of textiles and fashion in archaeology and anthropology, because a lot of these people who were studying these things were men, and so they had basically just ignored all of the history of these things that were happening. It's like this idea of like calling things the Bronze Age or the Iron Age, when actually like humankind's first invention of like making a knot and like making clothing was actually revolutionary to how the fact that we still exist today, right? And so all of these things were basically kind of ignored by a lot of people because they just didn't understand them, didn't understand like what these weights, like spinning weights or like loom weights that they would find. They never understood what they were, and so they just ignored the history and anthropology of all of these objects, which actually like changed and revolutionized the world. So if we think about like the American slave trade of like African American peoples, of Black folks, right? It was absolutely pushed forward by this drive for cotton, right? The cotton industry
Mm.
and the textile revolution, like that, all of that was really important. And because they wanted to be able to sell more cotton, they needed more slaves in order to be able to do that, right? So a lot of these things in history that we don't realize were actually driven by like the silk trade, right? The invasion of like the Middle East and China, like so much of it was because of silk. They wanted silk, right? They went to Peru, they went to South America looking for dyes, right? All of these things are actually so integrated to how we things that we do in our lives, but we don't realize how much of like war and colonialization actually is because of like fabric and textiles and like all of these things. And so this book kind of like finally like crystallized some of that for me. It was a book that was assigned for us to read in that history class in grad school, which I was very grateful for. As we were talking about this idea of women's work, like the reminder that, like the book was called Women's Work, but actually like the folks who work in costumes are not always women, right? It's mostly women, but it's a lot of women, right? But there's also, there are other people who work in costumes as well. And so like, if reframing this idea as like feminized labor, because it was more inclusive and actually like was more descriptive of like the work that we were doing and like how the perception of the work that we were doing. Yeah, the book is available in our bookshop.org. It's written by Elizabeth Whalen Barber. Please go check it out.
Huh. That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I've never thought about that.
Mm-hmm.
So when I don't know when both of you sign contracts, but on my contracts for theaters, a lot of times it'll say I'm not allowed to discuss how much I get paid.
That's illegal.
Really?
That's
Mm-hmm.
illegal. They're not allowed to
Yeah.
do that.
Oh,
You
that's
should
good
tell
to
them
know.
that. Yeah. Pay transparency is really important, and they're not allowed to
Mhm.
tell you that you can't talk about how much money you're making, because legally you have to be able to tell people about it.
Yeah, because then I don't know like how much my male colleagues have negotiated for and if I could have negotiated more for next time and oh, that's good to know.
So the other thing that we've also strongly advocate is talking to your colleagues about this. So before you sign a contract, to actually find out, just ask who else is working on the show, who else is doing this with us, and then asking, if not, if you feel comfortable asking the person you're negotiating with, how much are they making? If not, getting their contacts and reaching out to them directly. I've had many an email from like a co-designer working on a show being like, hey, this theater company told me that this is the fee and it can't go any higher. What are you getting? Because I want to make sure that like it's not always about like getting. It's not usually about getting more money. It's really making sure that like we're getting paid equitably,
Mhm.
or that on the same level, and that's what's important, right? So it's not, I mean, as artists often we either get underpaid or we subsidize our own art, right? So it's
Yeah.
not about getting paid more money per se. It's really about making sure that like people are getting paid equitably. That being said, if anyone asks you to sign a contract that says most favorite nations, don't do it. Get that clause out of your contract, because that clause is bad. Producers will use most favorite nations as a way to leverage a lower rate for everybody. So if they can lowball one person and get that person to sign a most favorite nations clause, which is basically states that like everybody has to get paid the same amount of money, which in theory sounds great, but then it makes everyone else's negotiation really difficult, because they'll say, well, so and so already signed their contract with the most favorite nations clause. We can't pay you more money.
Oh, I've never
Yes.
come across that. That sounds
Yeah. So that happens
Mm-hmm.
in design contracts a lot. So that's always something to keep in mind, that like it's something that sounds really egalitarian, but actually is used by producers to lowball everybody else.
Mm-hmm. This is also something that I haven't encountered specifically, but I know comes up with actors and stage managers, at least under actors' equity contracts. I also just wanted to jump in and say, for the most part, it's illegal. Just for our general listeners, to be banned from discussing your pay. There are certain areas, I just did a quick search online, that aren't covered by the federal rules, but they're very specific, and just sort of reading through them, I can't see how they would relate to theater almost ever. So just before you see that in your contract and just immediately go, this is illegal, just double check, just in case. We are not qualified legal
Yeah.
advisors.
We are not qualified lawyers.
Yeah.
This is true.
Yeah,
Disclaimer at the beginning of the episode.
this is I'm putting my producer hat on. Uh,
Yeah. So, what advice would you give for both of you, whoever wants to take this question? How do you negotiate for either, more money, more time, resources? I mean, there's so many things that can fall under a negotiation when you're dealing with contracts. What are some effective ways to negotiate well?
I mean, I would say just try not to fall into the scarcity trap, by which I mean that I think a lot of the things that we have all collectively decided to put up with in theater, that are so far below basic good working standards, come from this idea that you're so lucky to be there, and you could be replaced at any second, and there's somebody else who will do it for less. And if you were a true artist, then it wouldn't be about the money. it wouldn't be about the perks. You would somehow be able, I suppose, to sustain yourself on the love of your art as opposed to, being able to pay your rent and have food to eat. There's just this very intense attitude of that everywhere. And I think that it even gets messaged into students who are interested in theater. I remember when I decided I wanted to go into theater in high school, I already had this idea that it was an ideal to be a poor, starving artist. And that made you somehow more legitimate. And I think that we absorb that into our into our subconscious. And so it comes out when you're negotiating because you have this voice in the back of your head that says, if I even ask, will they think I'm too difficult and just pull the plug? And then I'll never be able to work with them again. And then they know people at 3 other theater companies that I want to work with. And what if my name comes up and then they say something bad to this other person? And then, it feels like a domino effect. So I would say try not to allow yourself to act from that place when you are negotiating. Try to remember that that's false. If you're good at what you do, and yes, you'll need some time to build a reputation, even if you are excellent, for people to know that. But if you're good at what you do, there aren't a million people who can replace you. And the companies where you will really thrive will know that and will value you. Yes, you will find artistic directors and production managers and small companies often, not always. There's some small companies that are great, but where they don't have any managerial training either. They don't know anything about negotiating either. And maybe they will, for some reason, be offended that you even asked if it was possible to raise your salary by a little bit. But that is not the norm. And if somebody were to truly drop all discussion with you after you asked one question of them, then I know it's difficult because you really wanted the job in the moment, but you didn't really want that job. Believe me, you did not really want that job. It would not have helped you. Every credit on your resume is not actually worth it just to have the credit. So I would say, like, you need to look at yourself as having value and something to offer to the theater.
So I'm actually going to share something that we are going to talk about at USITT in, well, less than 24 hours now. I'm actually on a panel specifically about health and safety for assistants and designers. But something that in our solutions that we're going to talk about is actually really helpful, not just about health and safety, but so the first one, like Shayna said, is to ask. So like asking questions of the information offered, because for example, with regards to health and safety, like if you can ask, what is the culture of health and safety in this in this workspace, right? So asking the question tells your employer or like the person you're negotiating with three things, right? It tells them that you value this. It's asking them what they have, and also seeing how they respond tells you like what that really is. So like not just like their response, but like how they treat the question, right? So if they laugh the question off, it's not really important to them. Or if they're uncomfortable and don't really give you a bit of a runaround, that's not something they've actually talked about or thought about really. Most importantly, they have this we are going to do this thing called a welfare values checkpoint. So asking yourself to like have certain, like, what are your welfare values, what are things that are important to you, and making sure that those things are checked off as you go through your negotiations. Because if they don't answer those things, or if a job doesn't answer those things, then you shouldn't do that job at all, right? Like it's probably not going to be to your benefit anyway. And so some of those things involve like, is your title perception being used as an incentive? Like oftentimes, like, they'll tell you, oh, you're an assistant or you're an associate, right? And they tell you, oh, because you're an associate designer, you have all of these more responsibilities, but then they pay you the same amount as they would pay an assistant. Or they tell you you're an assistant, but then your designer piles on all of these things that are like really about being an associate. And so being able to have, like, I think values that you go back to in a negotiation, and like understanding how you're going to, like, when you ask questions or when you're negotiating, like knowing that there are certain things that are goes and no goes for you. And when a negotiation goes sour, or like or something happens that like you're like, I'm not quite sure that that's something that I want to work with, then you know that you can say, I'm sorry, I don't think this is a job for me.
Mm-hmm. I would also say that just having boundaries is not the same thing as being difficult. Knowing for yourself what these lines are for you and being able to express them, in my opinion, to most sane people it's not going to ruin your hireability. Maybe it means you won't be right for a particular job.
And also, I think like often as like me personally, like as a woman of color, like it's like something that we like I often face, right? Like if I bring up a problem in a contract negotiation, like am I going to then be perceived as someone who is difficult to work with, right? And like is my tone now shrill, or like am I now demanding because I am demanding certain things and not relinquishing, not like moving on them, and suddenly I'm now difficult to work with. And in an industry where, like we pointed out earlier too, like so much of our work and so much of how we do things is based on connections and based on people that we know. Reputations are ruined easily, and particularly when you're women or a woman of color, like that becomes doubly more so, right? Because I know black female designers who like have gotten like a lot of backlash from that because they're perceived as being too loud and too angry, and then they're not hired again, and it's really frustrating because they're incredibly talented and they're loud and they're angry because they're not being treated the same as everyone else. So it's all of these things come into play in a negotiation, and we have to really think very carefully like how much to push and how to push. I've always found that like asking pointed questions is a way for me that works really well because it almost like lets people come up with their own answer. It tells me a lot about what they're thinking about it actually. Instead of telling them what I want, I ask them the question about it and then they get back to me. Makes them feel like they're in control.
Another thing that I would recommend is to go into a negotiation as prepared as possible. It probably sounds obvious, but I know, especially when I was a younger stage manager just starting out, I think that I had prepared for the interview or the follow-up discussion pretty well, but I'd sort of, I'd done the research about the company and I had my prepared answers for why am I a stage manager and why am I a good fit for this job. But I actually would get caught off guard when it came time to talk about the things that I needed and what I wanted to look out for. And I think, like a lot of people, I've ended up sort of making a list based on unfortunate situations that I encountered and not wanting them to happen again. If you can sit down and sort of think through, what do I think my job description is? Because that's a big thing in theater, is people have different ideas of what these jobs entail. People can have wildly different ideas of what a stage manager should be doing, of what a costume designer should be doing, of what a technical director is doing, etc. And so when you go in to speak to someone, you could even be negotiating for a position that's fundamentally different from what they think you're negotiating for. So I think it's important it might seem silly, but I think it's important when you begin a negotiation to start with, let's make sure we're on the same page about what this job is. Like, for example, in a lot of non-union theaters, people assume that the assistant stage manager is going to be the backstage crew person, maybe also doing the props, maybe also doing the laundry, maybe also doing the quick changes, maybe also doing all of those things. And that, I would argue, does not fall into an assistant stage manager's job description, or at least doesn't automatically. And I've seen assistants take jobs before where suddenly they have hours and hours of laundry. They'd never been in a role before where they were expected to do laundry at this new theater. That's what they were expected to do. They never talked about it. They wouldn't have taken the job, or they wouldn't have agreed to the money that they were getting on the job if they'd have known. Neither party thought to bring it up because they thought that their view on it was the standard view. And then the assistant, of course, being in a lesser position of power, didn't want to make any waves about it after the fact. So I think if you can talk to other people in your industry and sort of discuss, like, what do you think the norm is? Here's what I think the norm is. You can make a sort of a list of points that you need to bring up with your producer or whoever's negotiating with you to make sure that you're on the same page.
And it's also like just good interview etiquette to have questions to ask, I think, right? And I think that's something that I often forget in an interview is like, what are the questions that I'm going to ask at this interview? Because it also shows that like you're curious about the institution. You're not just looking for a job and walking in blind. Like, you have thought about the job and you've thought about what it entails and like the people that you're going to work with. And so just being able to ask questions and having those questions ready beforehand, I think is always helpful, because then you can ask them what they think it is and what their perception of it is as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all good points. One of the things that I'm really worried about is, well, as theaters start to open up, I'm afraid that we're all going to be so desperate to work again that we're just going to take whatever money is offered, whatever conditions, whatever, I've seen some theaters, that are saying, "Oh, we're going to open up at, you know, 20% capacity or whatnot." And I'm like, how are they going to pay good wages to the performers and all the people backstage and the musicians? Like, I'm kind of worried about that. I'm worried that we're all going to be so desperate to work that we're just going to settle for all of the things that we've been talking about, our problems, during the pandemic.
It's a very valid thing to worry about. It's something I worry about too. It's kind of why I'm also trying to wait and see like what happens with the industry before I come back to the United States. But also, yeah, that's part of why we wanted to keep doing the podcast, because I think when we recorded the first episode, actually the election was over. Um, and some of that anxiety had like dribbled out a little bit. But I think that also knowing that, we just spent 4 years and like how much all of these issues meant to us, that like in the wake of the pandemic and everyone being so happy to get back to what we were doing, we can't forget what has happened over the pandemic, both like the things that it's raised in terms of health and safety, and also like the Black Lives Matter movement, specifically in the protests of like 2020 and like what had happened. And like all of these theaters, like some of them made very empty commitments to EDI, or like had like very flashy statements on their social media. And like we haven't seen anything from them in terms of like what a concrete follow through on that is. And I think that like as we move further and further away from 2020, we are starting to forget that like this was a really big explosive thing that happened, and all these theaters made promises, and we don't know what they're going to do about those promises in these new seasons that they're now organized, that they're filling. So what's going to happen in the next season? Are they really going to keep their promise of like paying people equitably, giving equal opportunities actually, and also making sure that like people are actually like actors are supported, people are supported to do the art and do the shows that they're making money off of us to do.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like very often we also think about theater as like, oh, we have to help our producers save money, and it's such an irony, because like they're the ones making money off of this. Like at the end of the day, like none of us are getting rich working on these shows. They're the ones who are actually making the money. So here I am breaking my back on a show, like walking instead of taking a cab because it's going to save the producer like $15, and it's not actually sustainable or helpful either, both to my body and to like the show, and like this idea of like artists subsidizing the art, right?
Yeah, I think because of the nature of theater, these things can feel trickier because we all develop such personal relationships with each other. And
Yeah.
sometimes even you're developing personal relationships with producers, especially in small companies, and especially because so many people are multi hyphenates. So, there might be an actor who you already have a relationship with as like an equal colleague, coworker, who is also running a theater company that now wants to bring you on as a producer. They're a producer, they want to hire you. So the nature of the relationships, it feels even dicier to, or more difficult to perceive the line between employer and employee. Which I think is why there's so much of the artist subsidizing the art, also because a lot of the art feels so personal to the people who are creating it. There has to be a way, and I know there is because it happens in other countries and it happens in so many other industries, for us to keep what is good about the personal connections and how personal the art can be for us, but lessen the extent to which we are not acknowledging that this is a business and a career just like everybody else's.
I think the phrase "this is a career and not a lifestyle" is really important, right? And it's
Mm-hmm.
something that we often forget. Is there's this trope of like the show must go on, and I think we've learned in the pandemic the show can't go on, and there are sometimes the show has to stop, and it's okay, and it's for everyone's health and safety that the show has to stop, quite literally, right? And so if you're doing this in jeopardy of your own health and safety, or like to the detriment of your mental well-being, like it's something it can't always keep going like this. Like it's the same thing with getting paid low wages, right? If doing the job means that like you're not actually able to feed yourself, then like is that something that you should really like you have to think twice about doing it? And how like the conditions under which we go back to work post COVID, is it going to be safe? Is it going to be are they going to be making enough money to actually pay you a living wage? Like all of these things are really important things that we can't let go of, as excited
Mhm.
as we are to get back to work. I think in the pandemic, a lot of people have found alternative ways of either making money or having survival work, or alternative careers even that don't involve theater. And it's a little sad because I think on one hand, it's going to mean that we're going to lose a lot of talented folks moving off to other industries. On the other hand, I think it's important because it goes to show that like being able to do theater is a privilege. It's like people who come from privilege who are able to continue doing art, right? Because we've been able to like go to schools that like have taught these things that are maybe not so essential, or like it's a privilege to be able to keep doing theater, I think, and it's not always, and we get taken advantage of by producers
Yeah.
often
And like two
because of it.
thoughts that I have about going back, because I share the concern that both of you have, and we've heard from our guests, multiple guests have also brought this up. We have to stick together as a community. The most privileged of us cannot, because we love it so much and because we can afford it, accept the lower wages when we get back, at the expense of our colleagues who can't do that. We must more than ever be united in this. And a big way of doing that is going to be to keep talking about the uncomfortable things and to keep stepping forward and doing things like contacting the other people you're working with if you don't know them yet, and asking them what they're being offered on their contract before you all sign it. We're all going to need to be very open to doing these things that have seemed like they were taboos before. It's the same thing with any type of strike. Not that I'm saying we need to go on a strike, but like if individuals break through the picket line, the whole thing starts collapsing. So it's going to feel really scary because we're going to want to get back to work because we love it. But we have to unite to say, no, these things, we are still holding you accountable. All the work that we see you, White American Theater, has been doing, the new initiative that's been launched to stop 10 out of 12s and modify the 6-day work week, so many other things that are being discussed, we have to insist that they are put into action when we return. We cannot break away from that. This is our opportunity to move this forward. And the other thing is that we have to demand, I think, to be valued more by the public. If theater actually did completely go away, the public would have a huge problem with it, because it wouldn't, even people who don't ever go to theater, because theater doesn't exist by itself. The people who train in theater go into all sorts of other art forms. They become musicians, they go into TV, they go into movies. A lot of people have been pointing out how essential access to all of these things has been during this pandemic to keep people from losing their minds in isolation. And so maybe we have to call the bluff a little bit, and that is scary. But maybe we have to call the bluff and say, instead of we will accept anything to be able to keep doing this, say, no, this is a valuable thing that we will continue to offer to you if you will uh, pay us and provide for us what it is worth. In order to make that happen, we can't undercut each other, and we have to say, I think we have to be brave, honestly, and hold to that, because another issue, and you'll hear producers say it a lot, is I just don't have any more money. The arts are not supported in this country. And what am I supposed to do? Just not make art? And no, but also yes. Like we have to push at some point to make, okay, then we need to figure out how to make the arts more valued in this country, which obviously is a lot easier said than done.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a lot of friends and family who are teachers, and I feel like the teaching industry has a lot of the same issues that we're talking about here. Is, you don't love your students enough if you won't pay for school supplies and put in all these hours, and
It's emotional blackmail.
yeah.
Mhm.
That's a good way to put it.
It's straight up. It's emotional blackmail. I think in CPFWE, like Costume Professionals for Wage Equity, they actually had a really great bingo card. It's so fun. You should definitely look it up. Of like language to look out for in job postings, right? And how a lot of this language is manipulative. It's like, oh, we're all a family here. Or like we're looking for someone who's like a determined, self-reliant person, aka you're not going to get any help. Like there's like ways of coding all of these jobs and like how they're offered like basically like emotional language to convince you to do something or say something or to take a job doing something or make you feel bad. It's this idea that the show must go on, right? Like it doesn't have to. It's all manipulative language.
Yeah. Oh, this has been such a great conversation. I have a lot of things to be thinking about. Yeah, normally when I end my episodes, I like to ask like advice for young people. So I'm trying to figure out how to frame it the best. Maybe we could do like advice for people who want to do theater. What advice would the both of you give to people who want to do theater for a living?
It's a career, not a lifestyle. I
Love
think
it.
that's like the big one.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I would say, truly, this sounds like a pat dream fake answer, but truly, the more that I have insisted on maintaining a healthy work life balance, the more that I have invested in having a personal life and making sure that I eat regularly, even during tech, the better stage manager I have become. And maybe when I initially started to make that shift, I saw resistance because people were used to me not drawing those boundaries. But overall, I've gotten better work and I've gotten, I think, a better reputation and done better work by setting those standards. So, especially if you are just getting started, I would love to see the next generation of theater makers skip the whole early 20s back-breaking starving artist, that's just the way it is, and maybe if you make it through and don't burn out you'll stay phase, that we act like is essential to have theater. I would love to see you guys valuing yourself more. Just because you're entry level or new doesn't mean that you shouldn't be able to survive while you're doing your work. So that's what I would say.
Other industries don't require it. Why is ours like one
Right.
that does,
Mm-hmm.
The music for the Backstage Creative was improvised and performed by Ian Leroy, and the logo was designed by Carly Wagner.